Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this chilly evening. And welcome to Westport Reads 2025. This year, as you know, the selected book is In the Distance by Hernan Diaz. And while reading this book, our committee brainstormed many ancillary programming ideas. And one of the big things that we came back to over and over was that we realized that many of us didn't really know the history of the American West at the time of the novel. And so we are grateful to have found Kris Klein Hernández at Connecticut College, who is going to tell us a little bit more about the history of this country at the time of the book, so that we have a greater understanding of what happens in the novel. Dr. Klein Hernández is a United States historian who focuses on race, gender, and sexuality during the 19th century. Look out for his coming book, The Color of the Army, Forts and Race-Making in the 19th Century U.S. Mexico Borderlands. That's coming out. I'm not sure when. Maybe he'll tell us. He received his PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan and has taught not only at Connecticut College, but also Harvard University, Yale University, and Bowdoin College. If you'd like to discuss In the Distance, the library is offering several times to meet with others in the community, and those meeting dates can be found either at westportlibrary.org or in our magazine. We will be hosting Hernan Diaz in February, and there will be a live stream link available from the website for that event. We hope that you'll consider joining the Westport Reads conversation during this next month, and if you haven't read In the Distance yet, and you'd like your very own copy, we do have a few copies available for purchase this evening, or you can take them out from the collection. So without further ado, Dr. Klein Hernández will tell us more about what we really need to know.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. Let me get situated. Okay. Welcome. Thank you for taking time out of your evenings to join me for a chat. First, I want to thank the Westport Library for giving space for us to talk on Rappinger and Shattuck lands, primarily about the 19th century. And this is where Hernan Diaz's In the Distance takes place. For me, when tasked with introducing the history to you, I thought about an appetizer sampler. If folks don't know much about the West, I want to cover all the details, not be comprehensive, but I want to show you a lot of the gems of the United States West. First, by a show of hands, using your right hand, how many of you are from Connecticut? Excellent. How many of you would be from west of the Mississippi River? Oh, this is goody for me because less of you are from that area, so I get to talk a lot about it. Today's lecture will focus on some key moments within the 19th century, but we need to begin at the genesis of where the North American West starts. First, I'm thinking that in order to orient you to the large history of the American West, I want to focus on what I think is most important. Before I begin, in front of you, you see three photographs, stereotypes. The first one is of Maria Ruiz de Burton, who was the first Mexican-American author who published in English She was a California from California, and she published novels that made their way throughout North America. She was well-positioned and even had an audience with Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. In the middle, you see a stereograph of, in quotes, lower California tribes, Indians, end quote. This is an amalgam. When people say California Indian, what they're really talking about is the hundreds of native nations within California, but instead of asking for their tribal affiliation, their name, they then merge them into this category, California Indian. One thing to always take note of is when you see a stereograph, daguerreotype, or any kind of photograph, know that it's staged. In the 19th century, people had to stay still for a while. So while we have visual representation of Native people, know that behind the camera, someone is curating it. Finally, the last daguerreotype is of a Black miner in the gold rush in California. These three populations, Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Indigenous Americans, really shape the cultural milieu of the US West, in addition to Asian Americans, and I'll talk about that soon. But I just wanted to start off with these photographs to show you the diverse tapestry of this region. I told you I'm giving you an appetizer sampler. So here's the cart, the menu. We will begin first with what is the US West? In the distance, initiates its history, its beginning in California to New York. But most novels, films, travel literature looks at a different scope and a different trajectory from east to west. So after we talk about the US West, we'll get into North America's original inhabitants, indigenous North Americans. Afterwards, Spanish Empire within North America, which I'm calling Spanish Mexican America. Afterwards, we are on indigenous land, but we're in the settler society of the United States of America. So by giving this palimpsest of different narratives, I think that will help us contextualize the final part of this lecture, which is 19th century North America. You also see a map, and you're probably noticing half the country's not on there. And that's because the United States has yet to conquer, purchase, dispossess people to take it over. So, what is the US West? What does it mean to you? We're gonna do some wordplay real quick. Using your right hand again, I'm gonna start saying words, nouns, adjectives. And when in your mind, that word, adjective, reminds you of the US West, raise your hand. The Philippines, Hawaii, Ohio, Mexico, the Mississippi River, cowboys, Indians, yes, deserts, gold, yes. Every adjective I used has been imagined as part of the US West. In one moment of our nation's history, folks considered the Philippines to be the far western part of an eventual United States. They looked far across the land. Presidents like James Polk even considered adding Mexico as part of the US West. And at one time, we even have East Asian camels and dromedaries that occupy the West, that are shipped in, of course, from the imagined Middle East. So this region is expansive in its geography, and it changes over time with its actors. The first US West, so to speak, is really close to us. We call it the Old Northwest. So this is Ohio moving toward the Great Lakes region. When the 13 colonies existed, for them, what was West is different than what West is for us. So over the first 3 decades of the United States' existence as an early republic, West always changed according to the law of the land that U.S. settlers demarcated onto different territories. Indigenous North America has a rich and long past. While scholars and students are aware of ancient Mesopotamia, North America just as well featured technologically advanced native capitals. Just west of the Mississippi existed several indigenous cities. One of mention is Huhugum, situated in present-day central Arizona. And this city existed from 1500 before Common Era to about 1200 Common Era. Another large indigenous city was Cahokia, which exists in present-day St. Louis, East St. Louis. What was spectacular about these indigenous cities were their agricultural advances and their urban density. Cahokia, for example, housed a population on the same level as medieval London, Barcelona, and Paris. A mistake historians, anthropologists, and just US public discourse often tend to make about Native people is a declension narrative, or a narrative that when Westerners invaded North America, Native Americans died of disease. Yes, people died from disease, but something else occurred as well. These old capitals changed according to climate change. Climate change exists today, but historically, using topography, maps, the soil, our built environment in North America has changed dramatically over just 2,000 years. With these indigenous capitals, they thrived in a medieval warm period. So we're talking 7 to 10 degrees higher, which meant that agriculture flourished, which meant cities prospered. But over time, in the early 1400s, the globe started to cool down. This contributed to the decline in populations because of crop destruction. Then the globe cooled 7 to 10 degrees. So at the moment where Westerners invade North America and they start to see these cities are in decline, disease exists, but we also have to understand that the weather was changing at the time. Climate change has and always will exist. So I just wanted to orient you in terms of the long history of the land and the weather that has changed. North America before 1492 featured hundreds of indigenous nations linked through kinship, trade, and slavery. When examining the land that the U.S. now claims, Indigenous California serves as one of the most linguistically diverse regions. When U.S. surveyors entered California, this was apparent. These are 2 descriptors looking at the linguistic differences, but also the differences within climate. Other parts of North America also featured diverse nations of Native people, but in the distance, since it does initiate its start in California, this is why I want to focus on this part. Europeans, first Spain, and later the United States, along with France, sought to make sense of indigenous Californians. The depiction of Native people was initially tied to Westerners seeking to racialize Native North Americans. I'll speak more about this, but the iconography and pictorial description of Native people always looks similar. And so, through the 19th century, much of the detail that Westerners present of Native people are focusing on the color of their skin, the difference in anatomical quantification. How do they look different than us Europeans? One thing that you might have seen are these paintings, but know that many of them are rendered by Westerners. A lot of textbooks still don't illustrate Native art by Native artists. So this portrayal is always one-sided, but it's what we're presented with through grade school. Following the urban crisis of housing in Europe, Westerners sought real estate. After Christopher Columbus's infiltration of the Caribbean, the Spanish Empire began its invasion of the Americas, starting with Hispaniola, or present-day Haiti, Dominican Republic, by 1493. And three decades later, Hernan Cortez invaded indigenous Mexico in 1519, and 2 years later is able to reach the capital. By the late 1500s, Spain founds the Kingdom of New Mexico with Juan de Oñate as its first governor. This would be the region we know today as New Mexico. When thinking about European penetration of North America, Spaniards reach the Caribbean through Hispaniola, but then they make their way through Mexico up through New Mexico. So New Mexico is one of the first regions to be colonized by Spaniards. California will be its last, and that's because of distance. But by the late 1500s, we have a kingdom of colonists, Spanish colonists, existing in present-day New Mexico, then Texas, Arizona, and then by the 1700s, California. The process through which historians utilize a designation to talk about the behavior of Westerners in North America is settler colonialism. This is a term that's very specific to a North American context, but has been used to talk about New Zealand, Canada, Australia, Israel, and Palestine, as well as South Africa. But settler colonialisms is essentially when a foreign body comes into another land, infiltrates the society, eradicates the society, and creates its own image, or enslaves the population while still maintaining the image. In the case of North America, the Spanish, French, and English all utilize settler colonial tactics, but they differed, and we'll be talking about that. What's unique to Spain is the use of Christianity in racial caste. For folks who might be unfamiliar, Christopher Columbus, 1492, is coming to the New World, but many things are happening in Spain. There's expulsion of Muslim people and Jewish people, and a rise of Catholicism, Christianity. Through this, one's lineage, in addition to their blood and gender, structured their social position. What you see is a Costa painting in front of you. Looking at the detail, you'll see that the higher social caste you can have is predicated upon your whiteness or your proximity to a historical lineage, an ancestry that is of upper class. These notions were transported with Spaniards to the New World, so in many ways, religion and race demarcated society socially. This is a 1750 painting, but you can really see the blood purity, the lineage, and the European whiteness as the vehicle through which New Spain structured society. Spaniards understood that they were numerically outnumbered by native North Americans. So how can you overtake a continent if you're in the minority? The answer, religious salvation. So Spaniards came to the New World and plotted. They plotted maps and were made aware of the strong indigenous capitals throughout the region. This one map, which is looking at all of Mexico, of course, and then the West, features sections where Spaniards believed native people to be dense. Spaniards understood that through religion and the idea that you could be saved through conversion, through baptism, might sway native people to join their enclaves. Were they right? Yes and no. But it's important to note that for the Spanish Empire, they relied on a mixture of religion and race to structure society. As I mentioned earlier, New Mexico is the first area to be colonized. California was the last by the 1700s. Religious exploitation of native labor under the surveillance of the Catholic Church and Spanish military framed much of the West. In California, Spain established a series of missions to convert and detribalize native people. Catholic priest and missionary of the Franciscan order, Junipero Serra, helped establish 8 of over 20 Spanish colonial missions on the coast of California. Serra is a controversial figure. In 2015, Pope Francis, canonized Serra. But from the point of view of many people, including indigenous North Americans, Serra's intervention in the region looks very different, using religion as an imperial expansive force. So while many people were detribalized, baptized, we call them neophytes, they take on a different last name, they learn Spanish, not native languages, and then they adhere to Christianity, not to any indigenous religion, started to erase the cultural milieu of indigeneity. So remember that key word I said earlier, settler colonialism? Well, for the Spanish Empire, the erasure of any kind of indigenous faith, practice, lifeway, kinship would eliminate any other polity and would secure for Spain its dominion over the land. But native people never fully succumbed to Western religious imperialism. In 1680, Pueblo Indians in New Mexico, led by Pope, is his name, revolted against the Spanish effectively for 12 years. And many consider this the first American Revolution. In California, Quiche Dr. Torperina successfully led an insurrection against several of the missions. And this occurs in 1785. There are different missions, but for hers, it's the mission San Gabriel. Through Spain's occupation of present-day U.S. Southwest, the Catholic Church began to limit and or prohibit indigenous religious ceremonies, in addition to surveilling their culture, language, and even social and sexual relations. As consequence, baptized native people in 6 villages alongside Torperina led a rebellion. It was not successful, but what is exciting as a historian is there are quotations, alleged quotations, that Torperina herself made. And this is important to talk about because the voices of Native people are very much erased from US textbooks. But it's alleged that at the court trial, Torperina said, quote, "She hated the padres, the fathers, and all of you for living on my native soil, for trespassing upon the land of my forefathers and despoiling our tribal domains. I came to the mission to inspire the dirty cowards to fight and not to quail at the sight of Spanish sticks that spit fire and death, nor to retch at the evil smell of gun smoke. Be done with you, white invaders, end quote. It's alleged, so maybe she didn't say those words. Of course, people embellish. This is a transcript, and a man documented it, so maybe she didn't say word for word. But this shows us that this woman, a doctor, had the perseverance to stand against a Spanish empire. And it wasn't an isolated incident. Native people fought back, and what we tend to focus on historically is their declension narrative, whereas the story of Torprina shows us that Native people had moments where they can thrive and live, not just survive. We call that survivance. So, Spanish America, they create the Kingdom of New Mexico by the late 1500s. So over 200 years, then New Spain becomes its own region, and it is growing. So at one point in time, Mexico ranges from the border of Guatemala all the way to present-day Oregon. And by the 18 teens, Mexico, as well as other Latin American countries, start to come together and create independence movements. For New Spain, from 1810 to 1821, they are able to successfully remove from the Spanish Empire and become a constitutional monarchy for about 3 years. And then finally, by 1824, they are very much similar to the United States in that they're the United States of Mexico, United Mexican States. And there's no more monarchy. When you look at this map, you see present-day Texas all the way up to the coast. So that is the Spanish Empire. But in the early 1600s, 1607 and 1619, 1620, Anglo migration, English speakers make their way to the east coast of native North America. This Western polity, Great Britain, like Spain, also embraced settler colonialism. When I talk about the United States in an early time period, I like to call them United Statesians, because who is an American when we obviously had hundreds of years of Americans living here already? So I like to call them United Statesians. So United Statesians come to the native North America, and they start to question, well, what do we want to do with ourselves? We came over for real estate from a housing crisis, from religious persecution. Let's expand. So I like to use a quote by Thomas Jefferson to really talk about how everyday United Statesians in the early republic thought of themselves. I think Jefferson best summarizes the national feeling. Quote, "We shall divert through our own country a branch of commerce, which the European states have thought worthy of the most important struggles and sacrifices. And in the event of peace, ending the American Revolution, we shall form to the American Union a barrier against the dangerous extension of the British province of Canada, and to add to the empire of liberty an extensive and fertile country, thereby converting dangerous enemies into valuable friends." Empire of liberty. United Statesians are very aware that monarchies have failed them, yet they do enjoy expansion. So I think Empire of Liberty really captures the everyday United Statesian in the first decades of the early republic. British colonists who invaded North America throughout the 1600s relied heavily off trade and trust with native nations like the Powhatan Confederacy, but the early republic also engaged in the peculiar institution, specifically black chattel slavery. The reliance on indigenous dispossession and enslaved black labor allowed for the proliferation of the United States. So what makes this Western group unique is that in order to overtake native lands, they have themselves, which is a small group, 13 colonies. However, they also have a labor force, but this labor force is racialized. The reason why we say that is because slavery has always existed. Yet, in North America, slavery exists for different groups. Native people have slavery through kinship networks that's tied to lineage, to family. But for the U.S., the United States, it's tied to skin color, which in this case is phenotypically black individuals. This is a pictorial that is illustrating some of the horrors of enslavement practices. But as the United States grew over its first few decades, enslaved black labor was crucial to its expansion. We've been talking about grade school, and by a show of hands, your right hand, how many of you learned about Lewis and Clark? Wow, that's like the most hands. When I first learned about Captain Meriwether Lewis and Second Lieutenant William Clark, I had briefly heard about Sacagawea, the Shoshone woman who was along with them. But what most people don't know is that while we call it the Lewis and Clark expedition, York, the enslaved man who was brought by William Clark, also led the expedition. In addition, Sacagawea served as a translator. What was unique about the expedition is that thanks to the knowledge, what we tend to call ecological knowledge, the knowledge of flora and fauna, what makes you sick, what makes you doesn't. Sacagawea possessed this as well as York. But when we talk about Lewis and Clark, I'm just saying their names, Lewis and Clark. We rarely talk about Sacagawea and York. It's really the framing of it. I like to start with Lewis and Clark because I believe it illustrates the issues and symptoms with the United States, which is its reliance on slavery and on Native people. For the expedition, Sacagawea had an infant, and Clark, at the end of the expedition, Clark did not release York from enslavement. According to scholars, York remained enslaved for most of his life by Clark. So that also helps us think about these men, Lewis and Clark, and some of their political predilections in terms of the peculiar institution. Another keyword term, Western expansion. Western expansion helps us as historians talk about the movement of Americans from the east to the west. This painting by John Gast, American Progress, is one of the most popular paintings that we tend to associate in the 19th century. And this painting, in many ways, illustrates this notion of westward expansion. We see a woman in white floating kind of across the landscape. And if you take a further look, you'll see on one end, Native people, livestock fleeing, and then on the other, civilization, or Westerners coming in wagons. They're moving west because they're here to civilize it in their eyes. But in the previous section, people lived here. There were indigenous cities. So the point of view of American Progress shows us Americans are coming into lands that are barren. No one lives here. But in reality, people have always lived here. So I always like to show this painting to really encapsulate a feeling of Western expansion. In 1830s, Anglo-Texans began to bring enslaved Black people to Texas y Coahuila, which is a state of Mexico. In just a few years, Texans gathered and rebelled against Mexico. They wanted to create an independent nation called Texas, which they succeed in doing. And so in 1836 to 1846, Texas is its own country, foreign country. But as soon as that occurs, the United States takes note of Texas. And that is because Texas is slave owning. If it is brought into the United States, this changes the balance of free versus slave states. The question about Texas admission were on many Americans' minds, from Frederick Douglass to Walt Whitman. But in 1845, a Democratic writer named John O'Sullivan wrote that, quote, "In favor of elevating this question of the reception of Texas into the Union, the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent, allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." This quote, most people took and they saw manifest destiny, and it became another term to help encapsulate why Americans felt they needed to expand. The use of manifest destiny then overtook the American historical imagination. This painting, many folks associate this with a notion of manifest destiny. Our goal as the United States is to come to North America and overtake it. And this is seen in the art that we produce, the literature that we write. John O'Sullivan was an ordinary man, but his ideology was shared by many United Statesians, especially James Polk, the US president. So, Texas becomes a US state. This throws off the balance of slave versus free states. And James Polk, who wanted even more territory, sent delegates to Mexico City to offer to purchase the land from Texas to California up for $22 million. Mexico, of course, said no. So then Polk sent 80 troops into Mexico to provoke Mexico. Mexico took this as an act of war. They declared war. This is why I call it the U.S. War with Mexico. Textbooks tend to call it the Mexican-American War, but I don't think it does it justice because Mexico wasn't the instigator. The United States, well, James Polk was. The U.S. war with Mexico lasts almost 2 years, but the United States wins the war, of course, gives $15 million, not 22, to Mexico for the purchase of their claimed indigenous lands from Texas to Oregon. What also occurs is a treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and this treaty reshaped U.S. citizenship for the region. Mexicans living in the newly claimed area had 1 year to choose between being now a U.S. citizen or a Mexican citizen. If you chose to be a U.S. citizen, you can just stay in your homes. But if you wanted to remain a Mexican citizen, you had to move. This is quite hard for the everyday Mexican American in 1840s. So most stayed. Mexican Americans did not realize, though, that even with U.S. citizenship, they would endure racism and xenophobia as second-class citizens. Just 9 days earlier, before the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, on January 24th, 1848, carpenter James Marshall discovered gold at Sutler's Mill in Coloma, California. Over 300,000 people then flocked to California to scout for gold over the next 5 years. Numerous United Statesians from slave states also flocked to California to scout for gold, yet they also brought enslaved black labor. This is important because when Californians admitted into the United States, it's a free state. Yet, as early as 1849 to 1850, there are over 200 enslaved black people that are counted within California. In this intermediary time, while California was supposed to be a free state and the peculiar institution is in practice, historians like to think of this moment as a don't ask, don't tell, thinking about the legislation of being queer in the armed forces. You can be queer in the armed forces, you just don't tell anyone. This was the bill 3 decades ago that was passed. When we take that and place it upon 1850s California, when thinking about enslavement practices, people saw enslaved black people, but no one talked about it. So historically, if California was a free state, maybe on paper, but in reality, it was not. To give an example of the size of how many enslaved black people came over the next few years, we as historians tend to compare it to data census records of free people of color, in this case, free black Americans. And that number's at 2,000 by 1852. So just in a few years, folks from slave states are bringing hundreds of people to California. The exodus of people to California had dire effects on California Indians as well. In just 1 year, from 1849 to 1850, over 100,000 non-native people, 2/3 of them United Statesians, arrived to California. This is a sailing ticket that you see trying to illustrate the beauty of California for someone who might want to come for the gold rush. So many people were flocking that at this moment within history, it is quicker to take a boat around and up through the Pacific to California. And so folks saw these advertisements saying there are different ways to make a journey to California. Between 1849 and 1852, over $200 million worth of gold was extracted. Mostly men migrated to the gold rush, men of Euro-American backgrounds, Chinese backgrounds, Mexican backgrounds. There were some women who migrated, like Lucena Stanley Wilson, who followed her husband and children to California. The main way through which people found gold was through mining and panning. Panning is simple. Most of you have probably seen it. You take a pan, and then you gather some earth, you drop some water, and you go in a circular motion. I just lost my place. Okay. The Smithsonian explains that the placer or surface mining, which is the other form of mining for gold, was the main form during the gold rush years. And placer mining was where miners worked with streams of long toms searching for gold in surface gravel. By the late 1860s, however, placing mining was not as useful due to the erosion of the earth. So only part-time miners or miners of Chinese ethnicity still use placing mining. These two stereographs show us examples of miners utilizing different technologies to mine for gold. So that brings us to now the 19th century and the background of In the Distance. 19th century North America features a series of dispossessions and a series of migrations east to west. starting in 1830 with Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, which gave Congress and Jackson the authorization to grant indigenous lands west of the Mississippi to native nations that were living in eastern United States, so the Creek, the Cherokee in Georgia. The idea behind the Indian Removal Act is we need real estate. We need to utilize all the real estate of the eastern United States, so any native people who are living there should be removed. Here's the thing, folks. We started with Indigenous California, so folks were already living in present-day Oklahoma. We're already living in present-day California. So if you're gonna dispossess native people from the eastern United States into the western, what you're doing is dispossessing people onto other people's land. When we think about this movement, this changed the way that native people interacted with the United States government. Another occurrence is the question of slavery. As more Western states are admitted, how do we reconcile the number between free states and slave states? Then finally, one thing that the West had was more lands. In 1830, the same year of the Indian Removal Act, Joseph Smith founds the Church of Christ, today what we know as Mormons, the Church of Latter-day Saints. But in just 2 decades, that church led by Brigham Young and his Mormon followers migrate to the American West, specifically Utah Territory, which is occupied by Native nations. This is what makes In the Distance so interesting, is that the migration pattern we see historically is always east to west. And it transcends not just communities, but religious practices, religious exoduses. One thing I like to do is talk about exciting histories. I never want to share with my students only sad stories. And so what I also like about 19th century North America are the type of people who existed. Mary Ellen Pleasant's life illustrates the diversity of antebellum California's citizenry. Pleasant, known to many as the first self-made millionaire of African heritage, identified as, quote, capitalist by profession, end quote, in the census late in her life. But starting in the 1850s, Pleasant sought to help enslaved Black Americans through the Underground Railroad. Scholars contest Pleasant's full ethnic background, as she was mixed race, but many believe that because of her background and upbringing nearby in Massachusetts, she was learned and she possessed a large knowledge of finance. She moves to San Francisco through the gold rush and starts to buy properties. Through these properties, she's able to amass a fortune. And late in her life, she is then, in those standards, a millionaire. Other folks tend to remember Pleasant because she also had issues with segregation and sued streetcar drivers for denying service to Black Americans. In this case, for her, she is a 19th century Rosa Parks. But not many people know about her, unfortunately. But the exciting thing about Pleasant is that she was a woman who navigated society because she was aware of structural power. And as historians, we find that out through her business dealings. For the purposes of In the Distance, Pleasant comes to California because of the gold rush. So the gold rush really serves as this moment that ties together different populations. Transient towns were very common in the U.S. West. When I say transient towns, I mean towns that don't exist forever. They exist as long as the utility of them exists. So many transient towns are next to mines. They're next to natural landmarks. And with transient towns emerged informal economies for drugs, sex, and other illicit activities. The Barbary Coast, which we know today as San Francisco, in the 19th century is known to others as, quote, the haunt of the low and the vile of every kind. The petty thief, the house burglar, the tramp, the whoremonger, lewd women, cutthroats, murderers, all found here, end quote. Another person, the same person, wrote, dance halls and concert saloons where men and faded women drink vile liquor, smoke offensive tobacco, engage in vulgar conduct, sing obscene songs, are numerous. Low gambling houses, all stages of intoxication, opium dens where heathen Chinese and God-forsaken men and women are sprawled in miscellaneous confusion are there. So to visitors, what they're seeing is a present-day Babel, a place that we might think of along the same lines as Sodom. But these types of towns existed throughout the U.S. West. In the novel, In the Distance, our main protagonist makes his way through some of these towns. Questions around sexuality are really hard to grapple with in the 19th century. The term lesbian and gay homosexual, these are terms that grow with the times and are very much centered within the 20th and 21st century. In the 19th, sex between people of the same gender, same sex, took on various meanings. Of course, we could say that queer people did exist. But according to historians who utilize memoirs, much of the sex that occurred in these transient towns were between two men. And that's because there were very few women in these areas. So men who had sex with men in the 19th century, especially in 1850s California, would probably not identify as homosexual or gay. Sex in this time period functions as an activity, but not perhaps maybe as intimacy. That's not to say that queer intimacy doesn't exist, it does. But the cast of characters within these towns, some of them might identify, many didn't. It was just an activity. Historian Susan Lee Johnson has found that the sexual worlds that the gold rush ushered in allowed for married men from different parts of the United States to encounter each other in Gold Rush, California. And this happens with our protagonist who encounters a man who changes his life. According to Susan Lee Johnson, the historian, men who came to California came for financial gain, but in many ways learned about sexual desires and expressions that they had not learned before. So while there was a proliferation of same-sex transactions, when many of these men went home, they went home to families. So it's hard to then, as historians, figure if many of these men identified. So that's why I tend to tell people that there's a spectrum and that we shouldn't call everyone one thing or the other, but think about the documents they left behind. The gold rush also had ramifications for the region, especially in regards to race and xenophobia for Chinese migrants specifically. Now, Chinese immigrants made their way to North America as early as the Spanish occupation of the Philippines. Along the way, they reached North America in the time periods in the 1700s. So Asian people, Asian migrants, made their way long before the gold rush. But following the gold rush, larger waves of Chinese migrants from Guangdong and later Guangzhou made their way into the U.S. West. What Chinese migrants experience, which is quite unique is their racialization alongside their sexuality. Westerners, specifically Euro-American men, start to talk about Asian men through their domesticity practices. Asian men are not presented in the same way as Euro-American men, so much of their representation takes on a queerness. What that means is that cities like San Francisco, later Los Angeles, are very interested in surveilling what Chinese men do in their free time. Over the second half of the 19th century, so if in the distance is mostly mid-century, what we see for anti-Asian discourses after the gold rush through the rest of the 19th century, anti-Asian sentiment intensifies through the region. Yet, one thing that city planners in San Francisco pay attention to is how do Chinese people live and who do they sleep with? In front of you is a schematic of Chinatown, the first original Chinatown, which now has been around for 180 years. But city planners were very interested. How do these migrants live? And what's their proximity to white women? This map shows different enclaves of Chinese prostitution. Chinese prostitution is in the green, but you'll notice a random light blue marker. That light blue marker is where white women, prostitutes, sex workers, thrived. So public work officials surveilled the social worlds embedded within Chinatown, with an emphasis on what Chinese migrants did in their homes, in their built environments. Not necessarily what they did for a job or if they had school. There's always the emphasis, what are they doing in regards to their race and sexuality? Chinatown still exists today, and there's many more throughout the country. But when we think about the U.S. West, the genesis of that Chinatown is situated within the Western American historical imagination. I started this rhetorical question earlier. What is the U.S. West? A palimpsest of historical narratives, of course, but what makes the U.S. West and its history unique is how individuals and institutions tell its past through framing. We started first with Indigenous California, Indigenous Native North America. We talked about the Spanish Empire that infiltrated through race and religion, blood purity. The rise of the settler society of the United States and its over-reliance on Black chattel slavery and indigenous dispossession. And then finally, the acquisition of a contiguous continent, a contiguous United States from one coast to the other. So then what is the U.S. West? I teach a class at Connecticut College called U.S. Wests with an S. Because one thing I want you to take from this appetizer sampler is that the West means different things for different people. I try not to essentialize the West. I've been living in New England now for a third of my life. I'm from Texas. New England also has a large indigenous history, especially in this region. In the U.S. West, however, what we see is the collision of empires. The Spanish collision with the United States, with the French fur traders, and with indigenous North Americans. We don't really see that same collision occur in a place like Connecticut. The Spanish Empire never really made its way here. But know now that there is a large cast of characters that exist who are not just Euro-American, and they set the scene for Hernan Diaz's In the Distance. If you haven't read it yet, know that there were specific reasons why I chose to focus on economy, sex, religion, because our main character will encounter those things. And of course, its author, Hernan Diaz, did his homework, so the issues that occur with our protagonists occur because historically they've existed. But if there's one last thing I want you to take from this lecture today is to think about the U.S. West as always changing, but never through one narrative, usually through multiple narratives. And that makes good history anywhere. When we think about the representation of Connecticut, it's great to hear about all of Connecticut's residents. Same thing with the U.S. West. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if anybody has any questions about this talk, if you could just come up to the microphone. I know there was a lot to bring in one day. So if anybody has any questions, just come up here. Okay, I guess that's it. Oh, wait, we have a question. Okay.
Hi. You talked about the impact of the Catholic Church in converting the Indians in particular. Can you speak a little bit about the role of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which I think comes into the story here? And I think it's an offshoot or a more radical group there, and its place in the West.
Thank you for the question. Many people who talk about the U.S. West mention Mormons. I just wanted to flag before I answer the question that there are also other religious minorities who seek refuge in the U.S. West. So the Church of Latter-day Saints. What's unique about the Church of Christ is that initially we're talking about Midwest, East Coast, Joseph Smith. This ideology is not embraced by many United Statesians. So the movement and exodus to the West allows Mormons to come in contact with indigenous people. Today, in Salt Lake, the legacy of removal from, not forced removal, to them removal, the migration to the West gave space for these religious minorities to rebuild themselves. And in order to do so, they also understood there were native polities. So I think what's unique about the Church of Christ is they are finding ways to interact with the area's original inhabitants. They're also very good at translation. So today, many people go to Salt Lake to learn languages because they, over the course of their duration, have specialized in language learning. So for them, what's unique is they're trying to acculturate, not assimilate people, whereas with the Catholic Church, there is that erasure of indigenous culture. You need to change your name, you need to speak Spanish, and you need to detribalize from your kinship networks and believe in our scripture. Of course, the Church of Christ has similar scripture, but its treatment, as historians are concerned, what we see are writings where there's an effort to acculturate, learn more about the region. Of course, there's also a lot of issues that other people have with some of the sects that then migrate to the West when thinking about familiar structures. But I think that's what's unique to the Church of Christ is they're coming in and they're assessing the situation. How can we thrive by also learning about the region, not just trying to baptize and eradicate native names and change the language. So it's a little nuanced, and I think that's really important given the location.
Okay, so I really enjoyed the book because it really took me right into that really important time in our country, a formative time, certainly for the whole West Coast and the rest of the country. And I was just wondering if there was anything particularly in the book that you thought obviously he did his homework when he wrote the book, but is there anything that particularly thought that he did really well to capture what it was like, or anything that stood out to you that said, oh, no, that didn't seem right?
Great question. Language. So in the 19th century, contrary, today, because of globalization, people speak languages, but in the 19th century, people also spoke languages. So I think both Diaz, who's an immigrant, and the protagonist I think, what would be very hard, because most of us don't speak Swedish or read it, is to have a book that would be written through how our protagonist sees the world, but then how he communicates with others. So the book is in English, but along the protagonist's pathways, he encounters people who don't speak English, and those folks might not even understand him. So to have a book that would stay true to language and the absence of communication would be something that would be really cool, but it's very hard to do because, I mean, he's a writer, I'm a writer as well. We publish in lingua franca English. But if he was trying to make it a primary source or trying to show the reader how hard it was to navigate land in the 19th century, I think the use of the different languages, it would be jarring to the reader, especially if they don't know these languages, but it would show just how hard mobility was at that time period, whereas now, I have Google Translate on my phone, but our protagonist didn't have that. And Swedish, of course, is a language people speak, but in the United States West, it's not a prominent language. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have one question. Could you expand on the reason for the creation of Texas from Mexico in regards to particularly slavery? Excellent
question. I'm from El Paso, which is the far western part of Texas, but we tend to think of ourselves more New Mexican. So Texas is a state of Mexico, Tejas y Coahuila, and it's one of the most far extreme north states. So what Mexico started to do was they embraced American colonists to come to Mexico, convert from Protestantism to Catholicism, to end or eradicate black chattel slavery, if they are practicing it, and to embrace the culture. And so Stephen Austin and others, we call them the original 300, make their way from Tennessee, those mid-states, to Texas, and then his son, Sam Houston, who leads it, starts to found towns where Texians, or white Texans, began to grow in size. But something was happening over the 1820s and early 1830s. Undocumented United Statesians were illegally entering Mexico. And so, you laugh, but it's true, it's true. They come, and so then Mexico in 1830 enacts a law that says that these colonists need to come with papers, but they also can't bring enslaved black laborers. Yet, United Statesians, that's what they're doing. So by the 1830s, there's enough pro-slavery Texians alongside Tejanos, or Texans of Mexican descent, who then come together and seek to rebel against Mexico. They're successful. Many people remember the cry, remember the Alamo in San Antonio. But then, after just 1 year from 35 to 36, 1835 to 36, they're able to achieve independence. And then Texas is its own republic that practices black chattel slavery. And I keep on mentioning black chattel slavery because indigenous slavery is still existing in this region. Mexico even allows it, but they banned black chattel slavery in 1829. So this is why American colonists or United Statesians who come want their own independent Texas, is to practice their original religion, they're Protestants, but also to live with the labor that they've enslaved. And so that's why Texas becomes its own republic. And then for 10 years, it's chilling, but the United States wants it as a US state. And so then it becomes a US state, and then shortly after, California becomes a US state.
Okay, I know that I need to go home and look at a whole bunch of maps to really get this in my head. But thank you so much, Dr. Klein Hernández, for coming out and teaching us so much of what we know to really understand in the distance. And I hope to see you all at other Westport Reads events coming up. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.